Hi, I'm Rachel Rudolph, the Extension Vegetable Specialist at the University of Kentucky, and today we're going to talk about post-harvest of acorn squash. So acorn squash is a winter squash type, but it doesn't have the post-harvest life of other winter squash. And so part of this project that we have is looking at the storageability of this acorn squash over different time periods. So this project, these bins behind me, contain 5 acorn squash or less from the field. And so this started as a multi-state variety trial of 10 different acorn squash varieties. We've got different colors, some white ones, some of the classic dark green. We've got some pretty speckled acorn squash, right? And so we evaluated them for field quality, so the yield in the field, right out of the field, and the quality. And we were looking for things that got cold would include heavy insect damage, animal feeding, of course, and soft spots or rotten spots, right? So all the 5, and when we picked 5 squash from each plot to be stored in these bins over the course of several weeks and weighed every 2 weeks. So we're monitoring how the weight decreases over time and also the quality. So the 5 squash that made it into these bins from each plot looked good initially. From just a visual assessment, we didn't cut into anything. And so they are every 2 weeks we're weighing them, and we may have to cull, of those 5, we may have to continue to cull as there will be soft spots. So acorn squash does not need to be cured like other winter squash. It also doesn't have the post-harvest life of other winter squash, as I said. And so maybe up to 8 weeks you can store acorn squash. And that ideally you would be storing it at 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. This room that I'm in is not, you can probably tell it's not a walk-in cooler. It's not set at 50 or 55 degrees. It's currently 74.5. I've got a thermometer here. And so we're basically at your classic room temp, right? And so that's where these have been. We're approximately 5 weeks out from harvest. And that's where these have been stored. And so, as I said, every 2 weeks we weigh them and we sort them again for quality, and we may have to toss some out. So I'm kind of looking at these squash, evaluating them for their appearance. And this one, you can probably tell, so a lot of acorn squash has that really nice orange spot on it, which can be a great indicator of time for harvest, right? This is like a maturity thing. But this spot, as you may be able to tell, hopefully in the video, is discolored and it's a little softer. It's getting a little soft. So I may be able to eat this today, no problem, but probably at the next weighing, we're gonna have a sunken spot, and it may be moldy even, depending on how this progresses. So something to keep in mind for growers harvesting and storing, right? You're gonna have to continually reassess your squash in storage for any length of time. So we're gonna learn a little bit more about what this means, what these spots mean, what kind of disease they are, how to prevent it, and what to look for.
Hi, I'm Nicole Gauthier, Extension Plant Pathologist here at the University of Kentucky, and I am working with Dr. Rachel Rudolph on her squash storage trial. So we're going to talk today about post-harvest rots. And by post-harvest, that means anything after we harvest. So for example, in storage. And these rots that we're talking about today are fungal, but we can have rots caused by water molds, oomycetes, for instance, Pythium, or true fungi. So what we have today is very clear rots on these winter squash. And so what we had to do initially is determine what this was. So sometimes these rots will come in, and sometimes these fungi come in from other things, and the infection actually happens during storage. But what we've got here, this is a Fusarium rot, and Fusarium is actually a plant disease that occurs out in the field. So here we're looking at an infection that occurred in the field, did not show symptoms yet, and then symptoms occurred later. So we call that latent infection, where infection develops but symptoms did not occur yet. And so that's what's happening here. So as Dr. Rudolph is processing and weighing these squash in this trial, she's encountering, yes, these severe rots, but she's going through and she's taking a look at any discoloration, any soft spots. That's her way to predetermine before we start getting this sporulation or all the spores being produced with this Fusarium. So with winter squash, we have a lot of colors, we have a lot of color variations that occur. So how do you know which of these spots is actually disease and which ones are not? And we're looking at firmness. We're looking at whether this pathogen has started to rot, and that would cause softness. So obviously, this is the point right before I'm unable to hold it. So it'll get so rotted that my fingers will actually go through. And the white you see here, this is sporulation or spores. And these spores are able to infect other fruit that are inside the bin. So we never want this to happen, but also we don't want these to make it to our customers' refrigerators. And so I've selected a couple here that are actually soft. So you see this, my finger is really, I'm able to push my finger through this one. So as you cull and as you monitor anything in storage, to be able to really take a look at what's going on and to feel them and press them and to detect a diseased fruit before it begins to sporulate. So that's really the key. So I'm going to cut this one in half here to take a look at what's happening inside the fruit. So it's not just the softness, it's the decay. And so now we see we've got some brown, we've got some rotting here, and you'll see the initiation of that soft spot. So this again is not something that you want to go to your customer. So even though we didn't have the sporulation and the sliminess happening, we definitely have rot going on the inside. And that this is about a week before we start to see this type of spot. So it's very important to take a look at this. On this particular rot, this is a Fusarium rot. Fusarium is a soil-borne pathogen. And by soil-borne, we mean that this fungus lives in the soil most or all of its life. It overwinters in soil, and it pretty much will survive in the soil. These fruit were at ground level, and that's typically when we see a soil-borne pathogen moving its way up into the canopy. It's because it's usually right there at the soil level. So soil-borne pathogens, they'll start out at very low levels. And as there is a host for them, each year we increase the amount of that fungus or that inoculum in the ground. So that's why we're always encouraging crop rotations into a crop that is not susceptible to certain pathogens. And that's really critical, because in the field that these squash came out of, we know there's a history of Fusarium rot. And so this is pretty much expected here. In fact, we're at the research farm, as you can probably tell. And at the research farm, we do things that a conventional grower would not do. And that's usually introduce very high risk situations so that we can better evaluate as part of our experimentation. But Fusarium, along with the other soil-borne pathogens, really critical to understand what the host range is on each of the pathogens. So we start with a diagnosis from our plant disease diagnostic lab, contact your county extension office, and have a confirmation of what's going on here. Because this pathogen will be here next year. In fact, it'll be here in higher numbers. So once we have a confirmation, we are going to rotate a minimum of 3 years. I prefer to see 5 years into crops that are not susceptible to whatever the disease is. And this one again is Fusarium. And so that's one way to break that cycle. Looking at resistant cultivars, so in your seed catalog, resistant cultivars are listed. Is there a resistant cultivar that you can rotate into? And then finally, for a conventional grower, to use fungicides as preventatives. So really important that we use fungicides to prevent infection in the first place. Fungicides will not be curative. Once disease occurs, we cannot reverse it. So we don't cure plant diseases, we prevent. So if there is a history of disease in a field, and if you are going to take the risk to use fungicides earlier in the season, in this case, just as fruit begin to develop, so you can assure that you're not going to have that, that initial infection occurring.